The crimson sunset over Nevada's Silver Valley stretched like spilled blood across the desert sky, casting long shadows over the Triple Creek Ranch, where Sarah Whitmore stood feeding her horses one last time before nightfall. The 40-year-old widow moved with practiced efficiency, her calloused hands gentle as she stroked the neck of Thunder, her prize black stallion that had been her late husband's pride and joy. Sarah's weathered face bore the lines of someone who had spent 8 years fighting to keep a ranch running in some of the harshest country God ever made. Her auburn hair, streaked with premature silver, was pulled back in a practical bun beneath a worn hat that had seen better days. The simple work dress she wore was mended in several places, testament to the financial struggles that had plagued the ranch since Jonathan's death from a horse-breaking accident. But those who knew Sarah Whitmore understood that beneath her humble appearance lay a mind as sharp as a cavalry saber and twice as dangerous when provoked. Jonathan used to say that his wife could outthink a chess master and outplan a general, skills that had served them well during their 15 years of marriage, but had been tested to their limits since she'd been forced to run the ranch alone. The stable that housed her 12 horses was more than just a building. It was the heart of her operation, containing not only her breeding stock, but also the hidden legacy that gave the Triple Creek Ranch its true value. What appeared to be a simple horse ranch was actually the front for the most sophisticated intelligence network in the Nevada Territory, a system that Sarah and Jonathan had built together during the Civil War and maintained in secret ever since. As Sarah finished her evening chores, she noticed riders approaching from the eastern ridge, their silhouettes dark against the dying light. 5 men on horseback, moving with the casual arrogance of those who believed themselves unopposed. Even at a distance, she could see the bulge of weapons beneath their coats and the way they sat their saddles. These were not honest ranchers or traveling merchants. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to the Navy Colt revolver concealed beneath her work apron, a weapon that had saved her life more than once during the dangerous years when she and Jonathan had served as Union intelligence operatives in Confederate territory. But she made no obvious move toward the stable or the house, instead continuing to brush Thunder as if she hadn't noticed the approaching riders. The leader of the group was a man Sarah recognized from wanted posters in the territorial marshal's office, Black Jack Morrison, a rustler and killer whose gang had been terrorizing ranchers across 3 territories. Morrison was tall and lean, with dead eyes and a mustache that failed to hide the cruel twist of his mouth. His reputation for violence was matched only by his cunning, which made him far more dangerous than the average outlaw. "Evening, ma'am," Morrison called out as his gang spread out to surround the stable area. "Name's Morrison. I hear you've got some fine horses on this spread." Sarah continued brushing Thunder, her voice calm despite the danger she recognized in the situation. "I have horses, Mr. Morrison, but they're not for sale, and they're certainly not available to men who ride onto private property without invitation." Morrison's laugh was like the sound of gravel in a tin cup. "Well now, ma'am, that's mighty unfriendly of you. See, my boys and I have been riding hard, and our mounts could use some rest. Thought maybe you'd be willing to trade some of your stock for our worn-out animals." The euphemism was crude, but clear. Morrison intended to steal her horses and probably burn her out in the process. Sarah had heard the reports from neighboring ranches where the Morrison gang had operated. They took what they wanted and left nothing but ashes and grief behind them. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Sarah replied, setting down her brush and turning to face the outlaws directly. These horses have been in my family for generations. They're not going anywhere. One of Morrison's men, a nervous youngster with a patchy beard, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Boss, maybe we should just take what we want and get out of here. This place gives me the creeps." Morrison backhanded the young outlaw without taking his eyes off Sarah. "Shut up. Timmy, the lady and I are having a conversation." He turned his attention back to Sarah, his voice carrying the false politeness that preceded violence. "Mrs. Whitmore, I think you misunderstand the nature of our visit. This isn't a request, it's a business transaction. You're going to give us your horses, and in return, we're not going to burn down everything you hold dear." Sarah's mind raced through the tactical possibilities, cataloging escape routes and defensive positions while maintaining an outward appearance of calm resignation. The stable behind her contained more than just horses hidden beneath the floorboards, was a cache of weapons, gold, and documents that represented 15 years of intelligence work. If the outlaws discovered that treasure, they would have resources that could fund criminal operations across the entire western frontier. "Mr. Morrison," Sarah said quietly, "I think you should know that threatening a widow on her own property is generally considered poor manners in these parts. The territorial marshal takes a dim view of such behavior." Morrison's grin revealed teeth stained with tobacco and neglect. "The territorial marshal is 50 miles away, ma'am, and he's got his hands full with Apache troubles down south. Nobody's coming to help you tonight." As if to emphasize his point, Morrison drew his Colt Peacemaker and aimed it casually in Sarah's direction. His men followed suit, their weapons glinting in the last rays of sunlight like harbingers of violence and death. But Sarah Whitmore had faced death before, in Confederate prison camps and Union battlefields, where her intelligence work had taken her into the heart of enemy territory. She had learned long ago that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to think clearly despite fear's presence. "Very well, Mr. Morrison," she said with apparent defeat. "Take what you want, but please don't hurt my horses. They've done nothing to deserve your anger." Morrison holstered his weapon with the satisfaction of someone who believed the game was over. "Now that's more like it. Timmy, Jake, get those horses saddled and ready to ride. We've got a long night ahead of us." As the outlaws moved toward the stable, Sarah's hand found the small brass tube concealed in her apron pocket, a device that Jonathan had crafted during their intelligence work, designed to send coded signals across long distances. The mirror system they had installed throughout the valley would carry her message to allies who could provide assistance, but only if she could buy enough time for help to arrive. "Mr. Morrison," she called out, "if you're taking my horses, at least allow me to gather their papers and breeding records. Some of these animals are worth thousands of dollars to the right buyer." The outlaw leader paused, greed warring with suspicion in his calculating mind. "Papers. Bloodline documentation, registration with the Territorial Breeding Association, bills of sale that prove legitimate ownership," Sarah explained, hoping her lie sounded convincing. "Without proper papers, these horses are just stolen stock that any lawman will recognize. With documentation, you can sell them legally in California or Colorado." Morrison's eyes lit up with avarice. Like most criminals, he understood that stolen goods were only valuable if they could be converted to cash without attracting legal attention. "How long would it take you to gather these papers?" 20 minutes, perhaps 30, Sarah replied. "The documents are stored in my house, and I'll need time to organize them properly." The outlaw leader considered this request, while his men continued preparing the horses for theft. Finally, greed overcame caution. 15 minutes, ma'am. Not a second longer. And don't try anything clever. Jake here will be watching you from the porch. As Sarah walked toward her modest ranch house, she could feel Jake's eyes following her every movement. The documents she had mentioned were real enough. Jonathan had been meticulous about keeping proper records for their horse breeding operation. But the real purpose of her trip inside was to activate the emergency protocols she and her late husband had established for exactly this type of crisis. The house itself was a testament to Jonathan's paranoid thoroughness and Sarah's domestic ingenuity. What appeared to be a simple frontier dwelling was actually a fortress, with reinforced walls, hidden weapons caches, and communication equipment that could summon help from across the territory. More importantly, it contained the master controls for the defensive systems that had been built into every structure on the Triple Creek Ranch. Sarah moved quickly to the hidden panel behind the kitchen stove, withdrawing the brass signal device that would alert her network of allies to the danger she faced. A series of light flashes reflected through the mirror system would carry word to friendly ranchers, sympathetic townspeople, and the few honest lawmen in the territory that Sarah Whitmore needed immediate assistance. But even as she sent the signal, Sarah knew that help would not arrive in time to prevent the theft of her horses. Morrison's gang would be gone long before anyone could respond to her distress call. If she was going to protect her legacy and punish the men who had threatened her, she would have to rely on her own resources and the cunning that had kept her alive during the darkest days of the Civil War. The plan that began forming in Sarah's mind was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its implications. Morrison thought he was stealing horses from a helpless widow, but he was actually walking into a trap that had been 20 years in the making. Every building on the Triple Creek Ranch had been designed with multiple purposes. Every trail had been mapped with strategic considerations, and every neighbor had been cultivated as a potential ally in exactly this type of emergency. Sarah gathered the legitimate horse papers, along with several documents that would prove far more valuable to her enemies than they could possibly imagine. Hidden among the breeding records and bills of sale were coded messages that would appear meaningless to casual observers, but would provide devastating intelligence about Morrison's operations to anyone trained to read them properly. As she prepared to return to the stable, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the hallway mirror and was startled by what she saw. Gone was the humble frontier widow who had been feeding horses just minutes before. In her place stood someone whose eyes held the cold calculation of a master strategist and whose movements carried the confidence of someone who had never lost a battle that truly mattered. Jonathan's voice echoed in her memory from their final conversation, before the accident that claimed his life. "Sarah, my dear, if anything ever happens to me, remember that the ranch is more than just our home. It's our legacy, everything we built together, all the networks and relationships and hidden resources. They'll be yours to command. Use them wisely, but don't hesitate to use them when the time comes." The time had come. As Sarah walked back toward the stable where Morrison's gang was completing their theft, she carried with her not just horse papers, but the tools of vengeance that would transform this night from a simple robbery into a lesson that would echo across the frontier for years to come. Morrison and his men had no idea that they were about to discover the difference between stealing from a helpless widow and threatening someone who had spent 15 years learning how to destroy enemies who underestimated her capabilities. The game was about to begin, and Sarah Whitmore held all the cards. "Hey folks, can you feel that tension building?" Sarah's not just any ordinary widow. There's clearly more to her story than meets the eye. I'm getting some serious strategic mastermind vibes here. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop a comment below and let me know what you think Sarah's planning. And if you're already hooked on this tale of frontier justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The 15 minutes Sarah had requested stretched like an eternity as she watched Morrison's men load her prize horses into a makeshift corral they'd constructed near the stable. Each animal represented years of careful breeding and training, but more importantly, they were the visible symbol of everything she and Jonathan had built together. Losing them would be devastating, but allowing Morrison to escape unpunished would be even worse. As Sarah emerged from the house with an armful of documents, she noticed that the outlaws had grown careless in their confidence. Timmy, the young one who had seemed nervous earlier, was now laughing as he admired Thunder's magnificent lines. Jake had abandoned his watch post to help with the horses, and even Morrison himself seemed relaxed, counting his stolen bounty with the satisfaction of a man who believed his work was nearly done. "Here are the papers you requested," Sarah said, approaching Morrison with apparent resignation. "Each horse has complete documentation going back 3 generations." Morrison accepted the papers with greedy hands, his eyes scanning documents he couldn't read properly, but which looked official enough to satisfy his limited intelligence. "This is more like it, ma'am. With papers like these, we can sell this stock anywhere from Denver to San Francisco." Sarah nodded meekly, but her mind was cataloging every detail of the outlaws' appearance, their weapons, their horses, and most importantly, their casual comments about future plans. Years of intelligence work had taught her that careless criminals often revealed more information than they intended when they believed themselves among friends. "Where do you plan to take them?" she asked, playing the role of a defeated woman, making conversation with her conquerors. Morrison's chest swelled with pride as he gestured toward the Eastern Trail. "Got a buyer in Carson City who asks no questions and pays top dollar. We'll be there by tomorrow night. And by the end of the week, these animals will be working silver mines in the Sierra Nevada." The information was exactly what Sarah needed to complete her plans. Carson City was 3 days hard riding through mountain passes that offered numerous opportunities for ambush and reversal of fortune. More importantly, the route Morrison had chosen would take him through territory where Sarah's network of allies was strongest. "That's quite a journey," Sarah observed. "I hope you have enough supplies for the trip." One of Morrison's men, a stocky outlaw with a distinctive scar across his left cheek, laughed roughly. "Don't you worry about us, lady. We've got everything we need. And if we don't, we'll just take it from whoever we meet along the way." Sarah filed away the casual admission of future crimes, adding it to the growing list of charges that would eventually bring Morrison's gang to justice. But justice, she had learned, was not always served by courts and judges. Sometimes it required more direct intervention from those with the will and means to act. As the outlaws prepared to depart with their stolen horses, Morrison approached Sarah with an expression that made her blood run cold. "Mrs. Whitmore, you've been very cooperative tonight, and I appreciate that. But I'm afraid I can't leave you here to send word to the law about our little transaction." Sarah's hand moved imperceptibly toward the concealed Navy Colt, but she kept her voice steady. "What do you mean, Mr. Morrison?" "I mean that witnesses can be inconvenient," Morrison replied, drawing his peacemaker with casual cruelty. "Nothing personal. You understand. Just business." The other outlaws tensed, recognizing that their leader was about to escalate from theft to murder. Even among criminals, there were lines that some men hesitated to cross, and killing a woman in cold blood was one of them. But before Morrison could squeeze the trigger, Sarah played the card she had been saving for exactly this moment. "Mr. Morrison, before you do something you might regret, perhaps you should know who you're really dealing with." Morrison's finger hesitated on the trigger, curiosity warring with his killer instincts. "Lady, I know exactly who I'm dealing with, a widow with more horses than sense." Sarah's laugh was soft, but carried an undertone that made all 5 outlaws suddenly uncomfortable. "Mr. Morrison, my maiden name was Sarah Caldwell. Perhaps you've heard of my family's work during the recent unpleasantness." The name hit Morrison like a physical blow, even in the criminal underworld. The Caldwell family's reputation as Union intelligence operatives was legendary. During the Civil War, they had been responsible for exposing Confederate spy networks, disrupting supply lines, and gathering information that had helped the Union Army win crucial battles across the Western theater. "That's impossible," Morrison said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "The Caldwells disappeared after the war ended." "We didn't disappear," Sarah corrected gently. "We simply chose to live quietly, raising horses and enjoying the peace we had helped to win. But Mr. Morrison, threatening the last of the Caldwell family was a very poor decision on your part." As if summoned by her words, lantern lights began appearing on the ridges surrounding the Triple Creek Ranch. First 1, then 3, then a dozen points of light that marked the positions of armed men who had responded to Sarah's earlier signal. Morrison's gang found themselves surrounded by shadows that could be friendly neighbors or territorial marshals or military units. They had no way of knowing which. "You see, gentlemen," Sarah continued conversationally, "my late husband and I spent 15 years building relationships throughout this territory. Ranchers who owe us favors, lawmen who trust our judgment, former soldiers who remember what we did for the Union cause. Did you really think you could attack the Triple Creek Ranch without consequences?" Morrison's face had gone pale beneath his tan, but he kept his weapon trained on Sarah, even as his men began looking nervously at the growing number of lights on the surrounding hills. "You're bluffing. Lady, nobody could organize that kind of response in 15 minutes. Sarah's smile was cold as winter moonlight. "Mr. Morrison, you've clearly never dealt with a proper intelligence network. The signal I sent from my house has already reached 15 different locations, each of which has its own communication protocols and response procedures. By now, every lawman and friendly gun within 50 miles knows that Black Jack Morrison and his gang are trapped at the Triple Creek Ranch." The psychological pressure was having its intended effect. Timmy, the young outlaw, was openly sweating despite the cool evening air. Jake kept turning his head to study the lights on the ridges, trying to estimate how many enemies they might be facing. Even the scarred outlaw who had boasted about future crimes was now checking his weapons with the nervous energy of someone who realized he might need them sooner than expected. But Morrison himself was made of sterner stuff. His reputation had been built on violent responses to impossible situations, and he wasn't ready to surrender despite the apparent odds against his gang. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said with forced calm, "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but it ends now. Even if you have friends in those hills, they won't risk a shooting war over a few stolen horses. Too many people would die." Sarah's expression softened slightly, as if she were genuinely sorry for what was about to happen. "Mr. Morrison, that's where you're wrong about the nature of my relationship with this community. You see, the horses you've stolen aren't just my property. They're the foundation of the entire valley's economy. Every rancher within 50 miles depends on my breeding stock to improve their herds. Every merchant in the territory profits from the horse trade that centers on this ranch." She gestured toward the lights on the hills, which seemed to be growing brighter and more numerous with each passing minute. Those aren't just friends coming to help a neighbor in trouble. They're businessmen protecting their investments, veterans honoring old loyalties, and lawmen responding to a direct challenge to territorial authority. You've managed to unite the entire valley against you. Mr. Morrison. The truth of her words was evident in the outlaw's growing panic. What had seemed like a simple robbery was rapidly transforming into a siege that they had no hope of winning. But Morrison, perhaps recognizing that retreat was no longer possible, made the decision that Sarah had been hoping for. "Boys," he said grimly, "we're going to fight our way out of here. Kill the woman and burn everything that will catch fire. Maybe that will give them something to think about besides chasing us." As Morrison's men began spreading out to implement their leader's desperate strategy, Sarah played her final card. "Mr. Morrison, before your men start shooting, you might want to consider what's in those documents I gave you." Morrison glanced down at the papers in his hand, squinting to read them in the fading light. "Horse breeding records. So what?" "Look more carefully," Sarah suggested, "specifically at the coded notations in the margins." Morrison's eyes widened as he began to recognize what he was seeing. Hidden among the legitimate breeding information were detailed intelligence reports about his gang's activities over the past 6 months. Dates, locations, names of victims, descriptions of stolen property, and most damning of all, the identities of corrupt officials who had been taking bribes to look the other way. "How did you—" Morrison began, but Sarah cut him off. "Mr. Morrison, did you really think the Caldwell Intelligence Network shut down after the war? We simply changed our focus from Confederate spies to common criminals. Every move your gang has made for the past year has been documented. Every crime recorded. Every bribe traced back to its source." The papers in Morrison's hands represented more than just evidence of his gang's crimes. They were a comprehensive intelligence file that could destroy the entire network of corruption that had allowed outlaws like him to operate with impunity across multiple territories. "But here's the interesting part," Sarah continued, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone revealing a carefully planned trap. "Those documents you're holding aren't the originals. They're copies. And the real files are already in the hands of federal marshals, territorial judges, and newspaper editors in 3 different territories." Morrison's face twisted with rage as he realized the full scope of the trap he had walked into. "You set us up." "No, Mr. Morrison," Sarah corrected. "You set yourselves up the moment you decided to prey on innocent people. I simply provided the rope for you to hang yourselves with." The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of the first wave of Sarah's allies, a dozen armed ranchers led by Tom Bradley, whose spread bordered the Triple Creek Ranch to the north. Bradley was a former cavalry officer who had served with distinction during the Indian Wars, and his tactical expertise would be invaluable in the confrontation that was now inevitable. "Evening. Sarah," Bradley called out as his men took positions around the stable area. Heard you might be having some trouble with uninvited guests. Sarah nodded toward Morrison's gang, who were now completely surrounded by superior numbers. Tom, I'd like you to meet Blackjack Morrison and his associates. They've been kind enough to confess to numerous crimes and provide detailed evidence of their activities. Morrison's response was to grab Sarah around the throat and press his gun to her head. Everyone stays back, or the lady dies. But Sarah Whitmore had not survived 15 years of intelligence work to be intimidated by a common criminal's desperation. With movements that seemed almost casual, she broke Morrison's grip and stepped away from him, leaving the outlaw leader facing a circle of hostile guns with nothing to protect him. Mr. Morrison, Sarah said calmly, I believe it's time for you to meet the consequences of your choices. The psychological pressure of complete encirclement, combined with the revelation that their crimes had been thoroughly documented, finally broke the will of Morrison's gang. One by one, they threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender, leaving their leader isolated and defiant in the center of the stable yard. Morrison himself lasted another 30 seconds before the reality of his situation penetrated his criminal arrogance. Faced with certain death if he continued to resist, he finally dropped his peacemaker and admitted defeat. As Tom Bradley and his men secured the prisoners, Sarah walked over to where her horses were still corralled. Thunder nickered softly as she approached, and she stroked his neck with hands that trembled slightly from the adrenaline that was finally beginning to ebb. Sarah, Bradley said quietly, that was some of the finest tactical work I've seen since the war. How long have you been planning for something like this? Sarah's smile held a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Tom, Jonathan and I started building our defenses the day we settled in this valley. We knew that peace was fragile on the frontier, and that sooner or later, someone would test our resolve. As the immediate crisis passed and the prisoners were prepared for transport to the territorial capital, Sarah began to understand the full implications of the night's events. Morrison's gang had been more than just common criminals. They had been part of a larger network of corruption that extended into the highest levels of territorial government. The intelligence files she had compiled would trigger investigations that could reshape law enforcement across the entire Southwest. But more importantly, the successful defense of the Triple Creek Ranch had demonstrated that ordinary citizens, properly organized and led, could stand up to criminal tyranny and win. The victory would inspire other communities to resist corruption and other victims to fight back against those who preyed upon the innocent. As the crimson sunset faded to purple twilight, Sarah Whitmore stood in her stable yard surrounded by friends and allies, knowing that she had honored both Jonathan's memory and the principles they had fought for during the war. The horses were safe, the criminals were captured, and justice had been served through intelligence and community cooperation rather than mindless violence. The widow's gambit had succeeded beyond her wildest hopes, and the legend of what happened at the Triple Creek Ranch would spread across the frontier, reminding future predators that some people were far more dangerous than they appeared. Dawn broke over Silver Valley with the clarity that comes after violent storms, casting golden light across the Triple Creek Ranch, where the remnants of the previous night's confrontation were still being sorted out. Sarah Whitmore stood on her porch, watching as Tom Bradley's men prepared to transport Morrison's gang to the territorial capital. But her mind was already working through the implications of what they had uncovered. The intelligence files that had trapped Morrison contained more than just evidence of his gang's crimes. They revealed a web of corruption that reached into the territorial government itself. Names, dates, and financial records that documented bribes, illegal land deals, and the systematic protection of criminal enterprises by officials who were supposed to uphold the law. Elena Vasquez, the Mexican woman who ran the valley's only general store and served as Sarah's closest confidant, approached the porch with a steaming cup of coffee and the worried expression of someone who understood that last night's victory might have created as many problems as it solved. "Buenos dias, Sarah," Elena said, settling into the chair beside her friend. "I heard the commotion from town. Are you hurt?" Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, realizing that she hadn't eaten or drunk anything since the previous afternoon. "I'm fine, Elena, but I'm afraid our troubles are just beginning." Elena studied Sarah's face with the perception that came from 20 years of friendship. "You found something in those papers, didn't you? Something that goes beyond simple cattle rustling." Sarah nodded grimly. Morrison wasn't working alone, and his gang wasn't just a collection of random criminals. They were being protected by territorial officials who took bribes to ignore their activities. Judge Blackwood in Carson City, Sheriff Patterson in Winnemucca, even Deputy Territorial Administrator Williams, they were all on Morrison's payroll. The implications were staggering. If corrupt officials at that level were protecting criminal gangs, then the entire territorial justice system was compromised. Honest ranchers and merchants had no recourse against theft and violence because the very people who should have protected them were profiting from their suffering. "What will you do with this information?" Elena asked. Sarah's hand moved to the locket at her throat, where she kept the photograph of Jonathan that had sustained her through 8 years of widowhood. "I'm going to do what Jonathan and I always did when we faced impossible odds. I'm going to find the one person in authority who can't be bought, and I'm going to give them the tools they need to clean house." The person Sarah had in mind was Federal Judge William Morrison, who presided over territorial appeals and had the authority to investigate corruption at any level of local government. Morrison was known for his integrity and his willingness to take on powerful interests when justice demanded it. More importantly, he had worked with the Caldwell Intelligence Network during the war and would understand the significance of the evidence Sarah had compiled. But getting that evidence to Judge Morrison would require more than just sending a letter through normal channels. The corrupt officials Morrison had exposed would be desperate to prevent their crimes from becoming public knowledge, and they would not hesitate to intercept communications or eliminate witnesses who threatened their positions. "Elena," Sarah said carefully, "I need to ask you to do something that might be dangerous. Can you ride to Virginia City and deliver a message to someone who can help us expose this corruption?" Elena's dark eyes flashed with determination. "See, of course. But Sarah, if these officials are as corrupt as you say, they will be watching for anyone who might carry evidence against them." Sarah had already considered this problem, and she had a solution that drew on 15 years of intelligence experience. You won't be carrying the real evidence, just a message that will bring the right person here to collect it personally. The actual documents will remain hidden until we can be certain of their safety. As Sarah began composing the coded message that would summon Judge Morrison to the Triple Creek Ranch, she reflected on the strange turns her life had taken since Jonathan's death. She had tried to live quietly, raising horses and avoiding the dangerous work that had defined their younger years. But the frontier had a way of drawing people back into conflicts they thought they had left behind. Tom Bradley approached the porch as Elena prepared to depart on her crucial mission. The former cavalry officer's weathered face bore the expression of someone who had just discovered that his problems were larger than he had initially realized. "Sarah," Bradley said without preamble, "we've got trouble. One of Morrison's men started talking during the ride to town, and what he told us changes everything." Sarah set down her coffee cup and prepared herself for more bad news. "What did he say?" Morrison's gang wasn't just rustling cattle and horses for profit. They were gathering intelligence about ranch defenses, water rights, and mineral claims throughout the territory. Someone with significant resources was paying them to map every valuable property in Nevada, and we think we know why. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. If criminals were systematically surveying territorial resources, it suggested a much larger conspiracy than simple theft and corruption. Someone with capital and political connections was preparing to seize control of the most valuable properties in Nevada, using criminal gangs to eliminate obstacles and corrupt officials to provide legal cover. "Tom," Sarah said quietly, "who do you think is behind this?" Bradley's expression was grim. The Morrison gang was just one piece of a much bigger operation. According to our prisoner, there are at least 5 other gangs operating under similar orders across the territory, and they're all reporting to someone called the Syndicate, a group of Eastern investors who plan to control every major resource from the California border to the Colorado River. Sarah felt her strategic mind beginning to grasp the full scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just local corruption or random criminal activity. It was a coordinated assault on the entire territorial economy by people with enough money and influence to subvert the legal system itself. "Elena," Sarah called to her friend, who was already mounted and ready to ride. "Change of plans. Instead of Virginia City, I need you to go to San Francisco. There's someone there who needs to know what we've discovered." Elena nodded and spurred her horse toward the main trail, carrying with her a message that would set in motion events none of them could fully anticipate. Sarah watched until her friend disappeared over the eastern ridge, then turned back to Bradley with the expression of someone who had just accepted a burden that would define the rest of her life. "Tom, I need to show you something that Jonathan and I hoped we'd never have to use." Sarah led Bradley into the ranch house, through the kitchen and dining room to a door that appeared to lead to a simple root cellar. But when she manipulated a hidden mechanism, the door opened to reveal a staircase leading down to a chamber that had been carved out of the solid rock beneath the house. The underground room was a marvel of engineering and paranoid preparation. Maps covered every wall, showing not just Nevada territory, but the entire western frontier, with detailed notations about resources, transportation routes, and political relationships. Filing cabinets contained intelligence reports dating back to the Civil War, and a telegraph key connected to hidden wires suggested communication capabilities that few people could imagine. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Bradley whispered as he took in the scope of the installation. "Sarah, this is a military command center." Sarah nodded, lighting oil lamps that revealed even more impressive details. "Jonathan and I built this during the first year after we settled here. We knew that the peace wouldn't last forever, and we wanted to be prepared for whatever came next." Bradley studied the maps with professional interest, noting the strategic annotations that revealed a comprehensive understanding of Western military and economic geography. "How much of this information is still current?" "Most of it," Sarah replied. "We never stopped gathering intelligence, even after we supposedly retired from the spy business. Every rancher who visited us, every traveling merchant who stopped for supplies, every territorial official who passed through the valley. They all contributed information without realizing it. The scope of the network was staggering. For 15 years, Sarah and Jonathan had been quietly building the most comprehensive intelligence operation in the American West, using their horse ranch as cover for activities that would have impressed professional spies in Washington or European capitals. "Sarah," Bradley said slowly, "if you have this kind of information, you might be the only person in the territory who can stop whatever this syndicate is planning." Sarah moved to one of the filing cabinets and withdrew a thick folder marked with coded symbols. "Tom, what I'm about to show you could get us both killed if it falls into the wrong hands. But I think you need to understand exactly what we're up against." The folder contained documents that revealed the true scope of the syndicate's operations. Mining claims that had been fraudulently acquired, water rights that had been stolen through legal manipulation, transportation contracts that had been awarded through bribery, and most shocking of all, a detailed plan for the economic conquest of the entire Nevada territory. "They're not just stealing individual properties," Sarah explained as Bradley read through the documents. "They're systematically acquiring control of every resource that matters: water, minerals, transportation, and political authority. Within 5 years, they plan to own everything west of the Rockies." Bradley set down the documents with hands that trembled slightly from the implications of what he had read. "Sarah, this is treason. These people are planning to create their own private empire using American territory." "Exactly," Sarah agreed. "And Morrison's gang was just the enforcement arm of the operation. They eliminated anyone who refused to sell, intimidated officials who couldn't be bought, and gathered intelligence that allowed the syndicate to identify the most valuable targets." As the two conspirators studied the evidence that would reshape their understanding of Western politics, neither of them noticed the shadow that passed briefly across one of the basement windows. Someone had been watching the ranch house, and that someone had just seen enough to realize that Sarah Whitmore represented a threat that would have to be eliminated before it could expose the entire syndicate operation. The game of cat and mouse that had begun with a simple horse theft was about to escalate into something that would determine the future of the American frontier. And Sarah Whitmore, the widow who had seemed like such an easy target, was about to discover that her greatest challenges lay ahead rather than behind her. Miles away, in a luxurious private railroad car parked on a siding outside Carson City, a man who called himself Colonel Augustus Sinclair received a telegram that made his blood run cold. The message was brief, but devastating. "Morrison captured. Documents compromised. Widow knows everything. Recommend immediate action." Sinclair was not really a colonel. The title was an affectation he had adopted to add gravity to his role as the syndicate's Western operations coordinator. But he was definitely dangerous. A man whose ruthless intelligence had orchestrated the systematic looting of territorial resources for the past 3 years. The capture of Morrison's gang represented more than just a tactical setback. It threatened to expose the entire network of corruption and conspiracy that Sinclair had spent years building. The colonel moved to an ornate desk and began composing a series of telegrams that would activate resources Morrison had never dreamed of. Professional killers who specialized in eliminating troublesome witnesses. Corrupt judges who could issue warrants for the arrest of inconvenient investigators. Political operatives who could discredit evidence before it reached honest officials. But even as Sinclair marshaled his forces for the counterattack that would crush Sarah Whitmore and her allies, he made a crucial error in judgment. Like Morrison before him, He underestimated the woman he was dealing with, assuming that superior resources and political connections would be sufficient to overcome a mere widow on a remote ranch. He was about to learn why that assumption had proven fatal to every enemy Sarah and Jonathan Caldwell had faced during 15 years of intelligence work. Back at the Triple Creek Ranch, Sarah and Tom Bradley continued their examination of the evidence that would reshape law enforcement across the Western Territories. The scope of the syndicate's crimes was breathtaking in its audacity. They had essentially created a shadow government that operated parallel to legitimate authority, using corruption and violence to control resources worth millions of dollars. "Sarah," Bradley said as he finished reading the last of the documents, "we need to get this information to Washington immediately. If the federal government understands what's happening out here, they can send troops and marshals to clean out this entire network." Sarah nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "That's exactly what we're going to do. Tom, but first, we need to survive long enough to get the evidence to safety. Once the syndicate realizes what we know, they'll send everything they have to silence us permanently." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley. But these were not the casual outlaws who had threatened the ranch the previous evening. These riders moved with military precision, and their numbers suggested a coordinated assault rather than a simple raid. Sarah quickly secured the most sensitive documents in a hidden safe, then armed herself with weapons that hadn't seen use since the Civil War. The Henry repeating rifle that had served her during reconnaissance missions behind Confederate lines. The Navy Colt that had saved her life in a dozen desperate situations. And most importantly, the tactical knowledge that had made her one of the Union's most effective intelligence operatives. "Tom," she said, as they prepared to face this new threat, "get word to your men that we're about to be attacked by professionals, not random criminals. These won't be intimidated by superior numbers or psychological pressure." Bradley nodded and moved to the hidden telegraph key that connected the ranch to friendly positions throughout the valley. Within minutes, the network that had responded so effectively to Morrison's threat was mobilizing again. But this time, they would be facing an enemy with military training and virtually unlimited resources. As the sun climbed higher over Silver Valley, casting sharp shadows across the landscape that had become a battlefield, Sarah Whitmore prepared for the fight that would determine not just her own survival, but the future of honest government in the Nevada Territory. The widow's gambit had evolved into something much larger and more dangerous than anyone could have anticipated. But Sarah had learned long ago that the greatest victories often came from the most desperate circumstances, and she was ready to stake everything on one final, devastating move that would either destroy the syndicate or die trying. The real war was about to begin. Folks, the stakes just got incredibly high. What started as horse thieves has turned into a massive conspiracy that could control the entire western frontier. Sarah's underground command center is absolutely mind-blowing. This woman and her late husband were playing chess, while everyone else was playing checkers. What do you think is going to happen when those professional killers reach the ranch? Drop your predictions in the comments. And if you're on the edge of your seat like I am, smash that subscribe button. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the Silver Valley as Colonel Augustus Sinclair's private army approached the Triple Creek Ranch with the methodical precision of a military operation. 24 professional gunmen rode in formation, their weapons clean, and their movements coordinated by years of experience in the kind of work that left no witnesses. These were not cattle rustlers or common outlaws. They were soldiers of fortune who had learned their trade in the killing fields of the Civil War and perfected it in the lawless territories of the frontier. Sinclair himself rode at the head of the column, his bearing erect despite his 50-plus years, and his eyes cold with the calculation of someone who had built his fortune on other people's graves. He wore the uniform of a Confederate cavalry officer, perfectly maintained despite the passage of 15 years since Appomattox, and his face bore the aristocratic arrogance of someone who believed that money and violence could solve any problem. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Sarah Whitmore and anyone who might have seen the incriminating documents would be eliminated. The ranch would be burned to destroy any remaining evidence, and the official story would blame the deaths on a revenge attack by Morrison's surviving gang members. Within a week, the syndicate would own the Triple Creek Ranch through a series of legal maneuvers, and the threat to their operations would be permanently eliminated. But as Sinclair's army crested the ridge overlooking the ranch, they encountered something that no amount of military planning had prepared them for. The Triple Creek Ranch had been transformed into a fortress that would have impressed siege engineers from West Point. Every building showed evidence of defensive modifications. The terrain had been altered to provide overlapping fields of fire, and the entire complex buzzed with the activity of defenders who clearly knew what they were doing. "Colonel," said his lieutenant, a scarred veteran named Captain Pierce, who had earned his reputation in Confederate prisons, where Union prisoners died by the thousands. "This doesn't look like a simple ranch anymore. Someone's been expecting us." Sinclair studied the defensive preparations through field glasses that had once belonged to a Union general he had personally killed during the retreat from Atlanta. What he saw confirmed his worst fears about the woman they had come to eliminate. Sarah Whitmore was not just a widow with dangerous knowledge. She was a military tactician who had turned her property into a killing ground. "How many defenders do you count?" Sinclair asked his lieutenant. Pierce continued his reconnaissance for several minutes before answering. "At least 40, maybe 50. They're well armed and positioned like they know what they're doing. Colonel, I don't think we're dealing with ranchers and farmers anymore." The truth was even worse than Pierce suspected. Sarah's emergency signals had activated not just local allies, but veterans from across the territory who remembered the Caldwell family's service during the war. Former Union cavalry officers, artillery specialists, and even a few ex-Confederate soldiers who respected Sarah and Jonathan's code of honor had converged on the Triple Creek Ranch during the morning hours. Tom Bradley had assumed overall command of the defensive preparations, his military experience evident in the way he deployed his forces and prepared for the coming assault. But the real strategic genius behind the defense was Sarah herself, who had spent the morning implementing plans she and Jonathan had developed years earlier for exactly this type of situation. The ranch house had been turned into a command post equipped with the most sophisticated communication equipment available on the frontier. Hidden telegraph lines connected it to friendly positions throughout the valley, while a system of mirrors and flags allowed for rapid communication with defensive positions that appeared to be empty ground to enemy observers. But Sarah's most devastating preparation was one that Sinclair's reconnaissance could not detect. During the night, while the colonel's forces were still assembling, Sarah had implemented what she and Jonathan had called the Trojan Horse Protocol, a deception operation that would turn the syndicate's superior numbers against them. As Sinclair's army prepared for their assault, they had no idea that they were being observed not just by the defenders they could see, but by federal marshals who had infiltrated their ranks during the approach march. Elena Vasquez had successfully delivered Sarah's message to San Francisco, where it had reached Judge Morrison and triggered an immediate federal response. Marshal James Butler, a former Union intelligence officer who had worked with the Caldwell Network during the war, had arrived in Nevada territory with a company of federal troops and orders to investigate the syndicate conspiracy, rather than announce their presence. Butler had chosen to gather evidence by allowing the colonel's assault to proceed under federal observation. "Colonel Sinclair," Butler said to himself as he watched the criminal army deploy for attack, "you're about to provide us with all the evidence we need to destroy your entire organization." The assault began at precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, with Sinclair's forces advancing in coordinated waves that demonstrated their military training. But as they approached the ranch buildings, they discovered that Sarah's defensive preparations were far more sophisticated than they had anticipated. The ground itself had been prepared as a weapon. Hidden trenches channeled the attackers into predetermined killing zones, where concealed marksmen could engage them with devastating effect. Carefully placed obstacles forced the cavalry to dismount and advance on foot, negating their mobility advantage. Most importantly, the entire battlefield had been mapped and ranged so that every defender knew exactly where to aim for maximum effect. The first wave of attackers was decimated before they could close to within 100 yards of the main buildings. Sinclair's professional soldiers found themselves facing opponents who fought with the tactical sophistication of trained military units rather than the enthusiasm of civilian volunteers. "Fall back and regroup," Sinclair ordered, his confidence beginning to waver as he realized that his intelligence about the opposition had been completely wrong. Captain Pierce rallied the survivors of the first assault, his scarred face reflecting the concern of someone who had just discovered that the enemy was far more dangerous than expected. "Colonel, these aren't just ranchers defending their property. Someone with real military experience is running this defense." Sinclair nodded grimly, his mind racing through tactical alternatives. A frontal assault had failed, but he still had superior numbers and professional soldiers who could adapt to changing circumstances. What he needed was a way to neutralize the defensive advantages that were protecting his enemies. "Pierce," he said finally, "prepare the men for a night assault. We'll use darkness to get close enough for effective action, then burn them out building by building." But even as Sinclair planned his next move, Sarah Whitmore was implementing a strategy that would turn his own tactics against him. The night assault he was planning would provide exactly the conditions she needed to spring the trap that would end the syndicate's threat forever. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, the battle for the Triple Creek Ranch entered a new and even more dangerous phase. Both sides prepared for a confrontation that would determine not just their own survival, but the future of law and order across the entire Nevada territory. The colonel's gambit was about to meet the widow's Cunning, and only one side would survive to tell the story of what happened when greed and corruption finally faced the consequences of their choices. The Nevada desert night fell like a shroud over Silver Valley, bringing with it the kind of darkness that could hide armies or reveal the souls of those who believed themselves hidden from judgment. Colonel Sinclair's forces had spent the daylight hours licking their wounds and preparing for a nocturnal assault that would bypass the defensive advantages that had made their initial attack so costly. But in the underground command center beneath the Triple Creek Ranch, Sarah Whitmore was implementing the final phase of a plan that had been 20 years in the making. The maps that covered every wall now showed not just defensive positions, but the locations of federal troops who had infiltrated the valley during the afternoon. Marshal Butler's men were positioned to ensure that none of Sinclair's forces would escape to threaten other innocent communities. "Tom," Sarah said as she studied the tactical display that showed enemy movements throughout the valley. "It's time to show the Colonel what happens when someone threatens everything we've spent our lives building." Tom Bradley nodded, his weathered face reflecting the grim satisfaction of a soldier who was finally able to strike back at enemies who had terrorized his community. "What do you need me to do?" Sarah moved to a control panel that Jonathan had installed during the early years of their marriage, when paranoid preparation had seemed like excessive caution rather than essential survival planning. "When I give the signal, activate the irrigation system, every hidden channel, every concealed pipeline, every water source we've mapped in the past 15 years. Bradley's eyes widened as he grasped the implications of her order. The Triple Creek Ranch sat at the center of an underground water network that extended throughout the valley, a system that Sarah and Jonathan had modified to serve multiple purposes. What appeared to be a simple irrigation system was actually a sophisticated mechanism for controlling the movement of anyone who tried to approach the ranch under cover of darkness. "Sarah," Bradley said slowly, "you're going to flood the entire valley floor." "Not flood," Sarah corrected with a smile that would have chilled Sinclair's blood if he could have seen it. "Channel. Every drop of water will flow exactly where we want it to flow, carrying our enemies into positions where we can deal with them most effectively." The plan was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. Sinclair's forces were counting on darkness and terrain knowledge to get close enough to the ranch buildings for effective assault. But the terrain they thought they knew was about to be transformed into something that would funnel them into predetermined killing zones while cutting off their escape routes. As midnight approached, Sinclair's men began their carefully coordinated advance. They moved in small groups, using the natural features of the landscape to mask their approach while maintaining communication through a system of signals that had served them well in previous operations. To any casual observer, they appeared to be professional soldiers executing a textbook night assault. But they were being watched by eyes that had learned to read the desert during 15 years of intelligence work, and their every move was being reported to defenders who had prepared for exactly this type of attack. "Sarah," came the whispered voice of Elena Vasquez through the hidden communication system. "The first group is approaching the eastern perimeter, 12 men, moving toward the stable area." Sarah's hand moved to the control mechanism that would activate the water system she and Jonathan had spent years perfecting. "Elena, tell everyone to take cover. The flood is about to begin." The release of water began silently, with hidden valves opening to allow streams that had been diverted and stored to resume their natural flow toward the valley floor. Within minutes, what had appeared to be solid ground began to transform into a network of channels and temporary lakes that completely changed the tactical situation. Sinclair's advancing forces suddenly found themselves struggling through mud and standing water that hadn't existed during their afternoon reconnaissance. Worse, the water was carrying them away from their intended targets and toward positions where defenders with superior firepower could engage them with devastating effect. "What the hell?" Captain Pierce began, before a rifle bullet from a concealed marksman silenced him forever. The night that followed was later described by survivors as a masterpiece of tactical deception and strategic planning. Sinclair's professional soldiers, trained to fight conventional battles against conventional enemies, found themselves struggling against an opponent who had turned the very landscape into a weapon. Groups that had been advancing in coordination found themselves separated by streams that hadn't existed hours earlier. Men who had counted on specific terrain features for cover discovered that those features were now underwater or surrounded by impassable mud. Most importantly, the communication system that had allowed for coordinated movement was disrupted by environmental conditions that made standard military signals impossible to maintain. But Sarah's most devastating surprise was yet to come. As Sinclair's forces struggled with the changed terrain, she activated the second phase of her plan, one that would turn the colonel's own resources against him. "Tom," she said into the communication device that connected her to Bradley's position. "Light the signal fires. It's time for our friends to announce themselves." Throughout the valley, fires blazed to life on hilltops and ridges, their carefully positioned flames spelling out messages in the military code that federal troops would recognize instantly. Marshal Butler's men, who had been observing the battle from concealment, suddenly found themselves with clear targets and unambiguous authorization to act. The sound of federal cavalry trumpets echoed across the valley as Butler's force emerged from hiding and began the systematic destruction of Sinclair's army. Professional soldiers, who had thought themselves engaged in a simple assault, suddenly found themselves surrounded by federal troops with legal authority to arrest or kill anyone who resisted. Sinclair himself realized the true scope of the trap when he saw the federal uniforms and badges that marked his enemies as United States Marshals rather than local defenders. His entire operation had been compromised from the beginning, and the woman he had come to eliminate had orchestrated his destruction with a precision that would have impressed generals from both sides of the Civil War. "Retreat," Sinclair ordered. But his words were lost in the chaos of battle and the roar of water that continued to reshape the battlefield, according to Sarah's tactical vision. The colonel's attempt to escape led him directly into the path of Sarah herself, who emerged from the ranch house armed with weapons that carried 20 years of deadly experience. Their confrontation in the mud and firelight of the flooded valley would become the stuff of frontier legend, a duel between corruption and justice that embodied everything the American West represented at its best and worst. "Colonel Sinclair," Sarah called out as she approached the man whose crimes had devastated communities across the territory. "I believe you came here to kill me. I'm afraid you'll find that more difficult than you anticipated." Sinclair's response was to draw the cavalry saber that had served him during his Confederate service, its blade reflecting the firelight as he prepared for a final confrontation that would determine the fate of everything he had built. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said with the courtesy that some men maintained even in the face of death, "you have caused me considerable inconvenience. I trust you understand that this ends with one of us dead and the other vindicated." Sarah's reply was to draw her Navy Colt and aim it with the steady hand of someone who had never missed a shot that mattered. "Colonel, my husband used to say that justice finds its level like water, seeking low ground. Tonight, your crimes have finally found their level." The gunshot that followed echoed across Silver Valley like a judgment pronounced by the desert itself. When the sound faded, Colonel Augustus Sinclair lay dead in the mud and water that had been his undoing, while Sarah Whitmore stood over him with smoking gun and the satisfaction of someone who had finally settled accounts that had been 20 years in the making. 3 days after the battle that destroyed the syndicate's Western operations, Sarah Whitmore stood in the main courtroom of the federal courthouse in Carson City, her testimony having just concluded the most comprehensive corruption trial in the history of Nevada Territory. The evidence she and Jonathan had gathered over 15 years of intelligence work had exposed criminal networks that reached from local sheriff's offices to territorial governors, revealing a conspiracy that had systematically looted millions of dollars in resources, while innocent families suffered and died. Federal Judge William Morrison, who had traveled from San Francisco to preside over these proceedings, was a man whose integrity was matched only by his understanding of the larger forces at work in the American West. As Sarah prepared to leave the witness stand, he addressed her with the respect due to someone who had sacrificed everything to serve justice. "Mrs. Whitmore," Judge Morrison said formally, "your courage in exposing this conspiracy has prevented the criminal takeover of an entire territory. The evidence you and your late husband compiled has given us the tools we need to clean house from the county level to the territorial capital." Sarah accepted the judge's thanks with the grace of someone who understood that victory always came with a price. The battle at the Triple Creek Ranch had cost her more than property damage, and wounded friends. It had forced her to abandon any hope of living quietly and anonymously. The widow who had tried to raise horses in peace was gone forever, replaced by someone whose name would be associated with frontier justice for generations to come. "Judge Morrison," Sarah replied, "my husband and I always believed that some fights are worth having, regardless of the personal cost. The people of this territory deserve to live without fear of corrupt officials and criminal gangs." As Sarah left the courthouse, she found Tom Bradley waiting for her with news that would complete the transformation of law enforcement across the Nevada Territory. The rancher-turned-military commander had been appointed as the new territorial marshal, with authority to rebuild the justice system from the ground up using honest men and uncorrupted institutions. "Sarah," Bradley said with obvious satisfaction, "Judge Morrison has authorized the establishment of a territorial intelligence service based on the network you and Jonathan built. He wants to know if you'd be willing to head up the operation." The offer represented everything Sarah had worked toward during 15 years of Secret Service, but it also meant embracing a role that would define the rest of her life. No more quiet evenings feeding horses or peaceful mornings watching sunrise over Silver Valley. Instead, she would be responsible for protecting an entire territory from the kind of corruption and violence that had nearly destroyed it. "Tom," Sarah said after a long moment of consideration, "tell the judge I'll accept the position, but I want it understood that we'll be operating according to the principles Jonathan and I learned during the war intelligence gathering and strategic planning, with violence only as a last resort when legal remedies have failed." Bradley nodded approvingly. The judge expected nothing less from someone with your background. "But Sarah, you should know that there are other syndicates operating throughout the West. This victory was important, but it was just the beginning of a much larger campaign." As Sarah prepared to return to the Triple Creek Ranch to begin her new duties, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a widow struggling to maintain her late husband's legacy while avoiding the attention of those who might remember her wartime activities. Now she was the head of a territorial intelligence service with responsibility for protecting thousands of innocent families from criminal predators. The transformation had been painful, requiring her to confront truths about herself and her capabilities that she had spent years trying to forget. But it had also been liberating, allowing her to step out of the shadows and claim her rightful place in the ongoing struggle between justice and corruption that defined life on the frontier. Elena Vasquez was waiting at the ranch when Sarah returned, her face reflecting the mixture of pride and concern that had characterized their friendship throughout the recent crisis. The two women embraced with the warmth of people who had shared danger and emerged stronger for the experience. "So," Elena said as they settled onto the porch that overlooked the rebuilt stable area, "it is true what they are saying in town. You are to become the territorial intelligence chief." "It's true," Sarah confirmed. "Judge Morrison believes that someone with my background might be uniquely suited to prevent future syndicates from gaining the kind of power that Sinclair's organization wielded." Elena studied her friend's face with the perception that came from years of reading people's true emotions. "And how do you feel about trading your peaceful retirement for a life of constant danger?" Sarah's hand moved to the locket at her throat, where Jonathan's photograph continued to provide comfort and guidance even after 8 years of widowhood. "I'm not trading anything. Elena, I'm honoring both my husband's memory and the principles we fought for during the war. Jonathan believed in building something good and lasting. I believe in protecting good people from those who would destroy what they've built. Both beliefs lead to the same conclusion." As the sun set over Silver Valley, painting the sky in familiar shades of crimson and gold, Sarah Whitmore felt the peace that came from finally understanding her place in the world. She was no longer running from her heritage or hiding from her capabilities. She was Jonathan Whitmore's widow and Sarah Caldwell's daughter. And those identities were not contradictory, but complementary. The Triple Creek Ranch would continue to raise horses that served the needs of the entire territory. But its greatest contribution would be the intelligence network that protected honest families from criminal predation. And somewhere in the desert night, the spirits of those who had died fighting corruption could rest easy, knowing that their sacrifice had created something lasting and good. In the weeks that followed, stories of the widow who had destroyed a criminal syndicate spread throughout the territories, inspiring other communities to resist corruption and other individuals to refuse victimization by those who believed might made right. The Whitmore name became associated with justice rather than mere vengeance, proving that even the most personal grievances could be transformed into forces for positive change. Sarah Whitmore, Territorial Intelligence Chief and Guardian of Frontier Justice, rode out of the Triple Creek Ranch toward her new destiny with her husband's memory in her heart and his principles as her guide. Behind her, she left a community that had learned to stand together against tyranny. Ahead of her lay a territory full of potential syndicates who had not yet learned that some people were too dangerous to threaten and some principles too powerful to corrupt. The widow's cunning had evolved into something larger and more enduring than personal revenge. It had become a model for how ordinary citizens, properly organized and led, could defeat even the most sophisticated criminal conspiracies through intelligence, courage, and an unshakable commitment to justice. Truth had indeed found its level, just as Jonathan had always promised. And in finding that level, it had created currents that would flow across the American West for generations to come, reminding future predators that some people fight back, some communities refuse to be intimidated, and some principles are worth dying for. The crimson sunset faded to purple twilight as Sarah completed her evening patrol of the ranch that had become the center of territorial law enforcement. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new enemies. But tonight, she could rest in the knowledge that justice had prevailed and that the legacy she and Jonathan had built together would protect innocent families for years to come. The cattle rustlers who had torched her stable thinking they faced a helpless widow had indeed shuddered at her cunning plan, those who survived to remember it. Anyway. But more importantly, their defeat had sent a message throughout the criminal underworld that the age of unopposed predation was coming to an end. Some widows, it turned out, were far more dangerous than they appeared, and some plans, once set in motion, had consequences that echoed across history itself. Well, my friends, what an absolutely incredible journey we've taken together, from cattle rustlers torching a stable to exposing a massive criminal conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. Sarah Whitmore proved that you should never underestimate a widow with a plan and 20 years of intelligence training. The way she turned the syndicate's own tactics against them, using water as a weapon and the landscape itself as an ally, just shows the kind of strategic brilliance that built the legends of the Old West, and that final confrontation between Sarah and Colonel Sinclair in the muddy, fire-lit battlefield. Pure frontier justice at its finest. Where are you watching from today? I'd love to hear your thoughts on Sarah's transformation from quiet horse rancher to territorial intelligence chief. Did you see that plot twist coming? Or were you as shocked as I was when that underground command center was revealed? And if you loved this epic tale of frontier cunning, hidden networks, and the power of intelligence over brute force, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. I've got more amazing stories of courage, justice, and the indomitable spirit of the American frontier coming your way. Remember, folks, sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who look the most harmless. And sometimes, when evil thinks it has found an easy target, it discovers that it's actually walked into a trap that's been 20 years in the making. Thanks for joining me in the dusty valleys and hidden chambers of the Old West, where truth really does find its level, like water seeking low ground. And justice has a way of catching up with those who think they're above the law. Until next time, keep seeking the truth, and never forget that even the humblest looking person might be carrying secrets that could change the world.